Hi, welcome back to Dad Drinks. I'm Dad. We're here where every pour tells a story, and got off the ship without any problems, so that's good. And we're back here in the Dad Drinks lounge, and tonight we are going to make the earthquake, and then we're going to talk about 1970s disaster films. So, what is the earthquake? Well, it's a drink with absinthe. This is going to be interesting because it's a whole ounce of absinthe, and I've never done anything with a whole ounce of absinthe outside of, the Sazerac. And with the Sazerac, you're just basically rinsing the glass with the absinthe. So we're going to see how this turns out. An ounce of cognac. Just to go along with the theme, this could be a disaster. And then an ounce of gin. We'll just use Ryan Reynolds' favorite, Aviation. Because that'll go along, because part of the disaster films that we're going to talk about besides Earthquake are also the airport movies. So, Aviation, airport. There's really nothing that goes along with cognac. Although maybe in Airport, which is the parody of every disaster movie ever made, perhaps the young girl with the young man is drinking cognac. I don't know. I know she says there's a whole other thing that we're not going to get into because right now, in this day and age, there are jokes that you can't say. Just like in this day and age, Blazing Saddles could never be made. So you just stir that up with some ice, and then we're going to put it in a coupe glass. And we're going to see, and this could be an earthquake or not. Who knows? Let's see. So, cheers. Very licoricey, but I guess that's the absinthe. I don't know. It's probably a taste you got to get used to. I mean, I guess if you're really into licorice, that would be a good one. But then again, could be something you have to get used to. I mean, I think the first time I ever had a Negroni, I was like, oh, this is way too bitter. And now I love Negronis and Boulevardiers and Negronis made with Mezcal. Did that one last night. Anyway, 1970s disaster movies. God, the 70s were filled with disaster movies, let me tell you. And the thing was, you went to the drive-in to see these. I mean, most of these summer blockbusters were not a thing when most of these first came out, just simply because the first real big summer blockbuster movie was Jaws. Up until Jaws, I think Jaws came out in '75. Up until Jaws came out, summer was just a dumping ground. That's where you just put movies that, nowadays they would put out basically between, Christmas and April, or Christmas and Memorial Day, where it's a dead time at the theaters or a dead time on streaming. So you put out those movies that you really are not expecting to do well. But they, in the 70s, you would do these double features and have these movies at the drive-in, and you would go out to the drive-in, and a lot of times what you would be going out to see would be these disaster films. And the guy who was the master of disaster in the 70s was Irwin Allen. Irwin Allen, I thought he put out a whole bunch of films and a lot of these disaster films that I grew up watching back then. And I went in and realized that, no, he did a number of them, and there are a number of very famous and very important 70s disaster films. But there were other people who did, other ones. Irwin Allen actually started in the 60s. And in 1961, he actually produced Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, which you may not realize was a disaster movie. Yes, it was a science fiction movie. It was about this futuristic submarine called the Seaview and the crew of it. But the basic plot of that movie is that the Van Allen belts, which are the radiation belts that surround the Earth, had caught fire. And they needed to launch a nuclear missile up into the Van Allen belts from the Seaview in order to stop the fire that was going on in the Van Allen radiation belts. Again, 1961, those radiation belts had just been discovered, and they really didn't understand what the situation was with them and how they actually worked and how they protect the Earth. So they came up with this whole story. They catch fire. It's melting the ice caps. It's causing sea level rise. And the only way to save the Earth is to blow them up. And then, of course, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea became a TV series, I believe, for 2 or 3 seasons. And then Irwin Allen is actually the guy who developed Lost in Space. So he was the producer of Lost in Space. And that was in the late 60s. That was right around the same time as Star Trek. So you could either watch the campy Lost in Space, or you could watch the cerebral, Star Trek, either or, whichever way you wanted to go with your sci-fi viewing habits. So then, in 1973, he comes out with the Poseidon Adventure, which, interestingly enough, is not anything that happened while I was on the cruise. There were no rogue waves, nothing flipped the boat over, thank God. And that was basically, that wasn't the start, that was like I would say the second wave of disaster movies. Probably the second big disaster movie that came out in the 1970s. The first one being Airport. And I thought he had produced Airport from Alex Haley's novel, and that was his first one, but it wasn't. His first real disaster movie in the 70s was the Poseidon Adventure. But Airport comes out in 1970, and Airport was probably a pretty logically grounded disaster movie, right? It's an airport in Chicago, in the Chicago area called Lincoln International. And Lincoln International is having a blizzard. They don't have blizzards out in Chicago. Of course they do. And it shuts down the airport. So that's the first problem. And then the second problem is that one of the last planes that leaves Lincoln is the Golden Argosy, which is supposed to be flying to Rome. And there's a guy aboard the Golden Argosy who is a failed, I believe his job is actually as a contractor. He has access to explosives, so he builds a bomb, and his whole plan is that when they're out over the Atlantic Ocean halfway to Rome, he's going to blow up the plane. And I mean, we haven't found the Malaysian Airlines plane from the early 2000s. So what were the chances in 1970 that if a plane blew up over the middle of the Atlantic, they were going to be able to salvage it and figure out that, somebody blew up a bomb. And then the other very 1970s part of that whole thing is that the guy who is going to blow up the plane buys airline insurance, flight insurance at the airport. You used to be able to do that. They had actual vending machines, and you would buy flight insurance for just that flight. And you'd put your quarters into the machine, and when it would, you paid for whatever coverage you were looking for, it would, at the bottom, spit out the policy stuff, the paperwork, and you would walk away. And I don't believe I have seen those anywhere in an airport anytime recently. I don't know when they stopped putting them in there. I'm going to guess sometime in the 80s. But you used to be able to do that in the 70s. So it was a rather grounded disaster flick. But the key thing about it, which then moved into the rest of the disaster movies that went on throughout the 70s, was that it was an all-star cast, right? The two main guys in Airport, the two main guys are Burt Lancaster, who's the head of the airport, who's the head of operations for Lincoln International, and then Dean Martin, who's the pilot for the plane. And then, surrounding cast around that are people like George Kennedy, who then goes on and becomes a fixture in that airport franchise, which we're going to get into a little bit later, as Petroni. So he goes on, through the rest of those movies. There were other, character actors who are, guys that you would see in every movie that you would look at and watch Airport and go, hey, it's that guy. But that was Airport. So then, Irwin Allen, 73, says, let me do this movie about the Poseidon Adventure. Now, the Poseidon Adventure starts to get a little bit more unrealistic, if you will. I mean, the boat flips over, it capsizes, and there are still pockets of air inside of it, in this ocean liner, that they are able to make their way through and get up to basically where the shaft, what they call Shaft Alley, which is where, the propeller shafts run through, because the young kid who is in that movie basically tells all the adults that he's studied the ship, or he's looked into it, or he's all interested in ships, and that is where the thinnest part of the hull is, so that if they can get up there, hopefully they can be rescued. In that movie, again, star-studded cast, right? You start out with Gene Hackman, who in '73 was coming off the Oscar win for The French Connection as Popeye Doyle. And you've got Shelley Winters, who had already won, I think, 2 or 3 Oscars by that time. And then Ernest Borgnine, who, you may think now, well, Ernest Borgnine, come on, he's just this, Italian guy who, is funny, and we get him in these movies. But the thing is, Ernest Borgnine at the time, he was coming off an Oscar win for a movie called Marty. And then you had Jack Albertson, who had just finished up Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, not Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. This is the original movie with Gene Wilder, not the one with Johnny Depp, where he had been Grandpa Joe, and he was a couple of years away, Jack Albertson was, from being on NBC in a series called Chico and the Man. So you had these famous, it was a cast that was kind of loaded with people. And then, Red Buttons and Roddy McDowall, who was coming off of, a series of basically being made up as an ape for the Planet of the Apes films. So then, '73, the Poseidon Adventure does big business. It makes tons of money for Irwin Allen. So now he parlays that. And he goes out and he tries to option a book called, I believe it was called The Crystal Tower. Except the Crystal Tower had already been optioned by another studio. So he options a book that's very similar to it called The Gold Tower or something like that. Both books were about this huge fire in a high-rise. And what does that turn into? He turns that into the Towering Inferno. And the Towering Inferno just went beyond even the Poseidon Adventure in terms of the amount of star power that it had. And if you look at this is the poster for the Towering Inferno. One of the problems that the studio had at the time was they wanted Paul Newman and they wanted Steve McQueen. And these two guys in 1974 were probably 2 of the biggest names in Hollywood. I mean, Newman was coming off of movies like The Sting and Cool Hand Luke and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. McQueen was coming off of, movies from the 60s, including The Sand Pebbles and The Great Escape and Bullet. So these were 2 huge actors. And the thing when you went to Hollywood, the big thing was who's going to get top billing. So they had to figure out on that poster how they were going to give the billing to Newman and McQueen. And again, if you look at the poster, what you will see is that on the poster, Paul Newman is lower, but he's on the left-hand side. And Steve McQueen is higher on the poster, but he's on the right-hand side. And why was that? Well, the studios looked at it because the 2 studios who had both optioned the book ended up making the movie together. The 2 studios looked at this, and the studio exec said, well, here's how we'll get around it. When people look at a movie poster or when people read, what do? They read left to right. So we'll put Newman on the left-hand side. But you know what? The other thing is, when you talk about top billing, who's higher on the poster? Who's higher in the movie? Well, then what we'll do is we'll take Steve McQueen, we'll put him on the right-hand side, but we'll put him a little bit higher than Paul Newman. And that's how they got away with it. But those 2 are the only 2 big names in that movie. You had Faye Dunaway. Okay? You had William Holden, who was a big-time actor back in the 50s and 60s. And was like, one of those guys that you get into a movie to bring back those people from back then. You had Richard Chamberlain, who was coming off of Dr. Kildare and getting ready to move in to become basically the miniseries king of 1970s and early 1980s television. You had Fred Astaire, who was famous for his dancing. You even had, interestingly enough, and I don't think anyone realizes, and I'm not going to say this kid was a big star, but Mike Lookaland. Yes, Bobby Brady Bobby Brady was in that movie. He was a child of a deaf woman that they have to go and rescue from their apartment because she can't hear the phone ringing. And because the power's out, she doesn't see the lights blinking. And then, of course, probably in the most ironic casting ever, you have O.J. Simpson as the head of security for the tower. Okay, so you've got the Towering Inferno. And then in 1974, at the same time, Universal says, well, we got to get in on this action. So they do Earthquake. Earthquake ups the ante. Okay, so you're thinking about it, right? Airport, you probably got about, so the airplane's a 707. You probably got about 100 to 150 people on it. So that's, your potential death toll there. If you watch the Towering Inferno, you watch the end of the Towering Inferno, O'Halloran, who is McQueen's character, who is the fire chief, turns to Newman at the end of the movie and basically, in one of the lines he says, one of the last lines he says is, we got lucky. We only lost 200 people in this fire tonight. But if you think about it, the tower in the Towering Inferno is supposed to be even taller and have more square footage than the World Trade Centers. So 3,000 people lost their lives on 9/11 in the World Trade Center when the World Trade Centers collapsed. So there were probably 10 to 15,000 people who were actually in those towers, who were, many of whom obviously were able to evacuate. So let's think about the Towering Inferno. Let's assume that there were 15. So, you've got 10 or 15,000 people that are potentially at risk. Well, earthquake ups the ante. Earthquake goes, let's have a big, huge earthquake in the entire Los Angeles basin, the entire area of Los Angeles. And then again, so you've got even more people, and then they up the ante with the star power by bringing in Ava Gardner, Lauren Green, again, George Kennedy, because he didn't get enough with Airport, and all these other people that come into that movie. And now you have an even larger star-studded cast for Earthquake. And then Irwin Allen finishes up in 1978 with The Swarm, which is basically Killer Bees, which was one of those things that, along with Quicksand, the Bermuda Triangle, and Stop, Drop, and Roll, that we Generation X kids were, wildly concerned about and thought would be much bigger deals by the time we became adults. But The Swarm has not Burt Lancaster, has Roger Widmark in it, Michael Caine, so the star power starts to wane by the end of the 70s. But Airport goes on. Airport goes from 1970, and then you have Airport 75, and they drag, Charlton Heston into that with George Kennedy, because George Kennedy becomes a fixture in all the Airport movies as Petroni, who starts out in Airport 1970 as a maintenance guy, and then basically becomes a pilot by the time we get to the end of it in 1979. It just keeps rising up the ranks in the particular airlines that are called for at Airport. So you have Airport 75, where a small plane collides with a 747, and Charlton Heston has to rescue the crew and land the plane because to get it over the mountains, the Rocky Mountains, because I believe it's flying from Los Angeles to Chicago. Airport 77, which has Jack Lemmon in it, along with George Kennedy, obviously, and Jimmy Stewart. And in Airport 77, they crash the airplane, that's right, into the Bermuda Triangle, because art thieves are trying to steal art from the plane. And then, of course, Airport 79, when it all goes off the rails, which is the Concorde. And by that time, Petroni's the pilot. And he's piloting the plane with, I believe, Armand Assante. I believe he's the French pilot for the Concorde. And Robert Wagner in that movie is a arms guy who basically needs to shoot down the plane because I think it's his reporter girlfriend or something. She has information on him and she's going to publish it. So he has to somehow figure out how to destroy the plane. But you had so many other movies in the 70s. Speaking of Charlton Heston, Omega Man, which was The Last Man on Earth. If you go back to I believe it was the 50s with Vincent Price, and then Will Smith remakes it in the 2000s. So it's about a guy survives a plague. He's the only survivor, he thinks, and basically zombies in New York. And I think he's in Los Angeles. I don't think he's in New York City. I think Will Smith is in New York City in that movie, but I think the Charlton Heston version is in Los Angeles. And basically, he has to fight off the zombies. You had Roller Coaster, which, along with Earthquake, was made in something called SENSURRROUND. They had all these weird things for movies back then. Like they would advertise that it was in Super Panavision, which was a movie making technique or a film developing technique. Well, they had for Earthquake and for Roller Coaster SENSURRROUND, which were these basically subwoofers that were in the theaters, so that as the ground rumbled in Earthquake, or as the roller coaster came by in Roller Coaster, it would vibrate the seats, and you would pick all that up. Early in the 70s, with plague stuff, you had like Andromeda Strain, which was, they brought back a microbe from space. It lands in the desert in Arizona and just, basically decimates an entire town in Arizona. And then they take it to a lab that they have set up that is underground, that is protected and everything else. And the climax of that movie is that the microbe escapes, and if the one scientist who has control over it doesn't stop the countdown for the self-destruct, there'll be a nuclear explosion to destroy the base. And then again, you go back to Heston, to Charlton Heston, and he was in a movie called Gray Lady Down. And Gray Lady Down was a disaster movie where a freighter slams into a nuclear sub and it sinks to the bottom of the ocean, like 1,500 feet down, and the only way to rescue them is to put David Carradine, who even at that time was pretty much a hippie and unconventional, and put him in charge of the rescue mission in a sub to go down there and rescue them. So that's, and then the 70s pretty much ended with Meteor, which was a movie with Sean Connery and Brian Keith. I'm trying to think of who else was in that. I think those were like the two main guys. Those were the two main guys. And, basically it's just that a meteor is coming. It was Armageddon or the other one that was the meteor movie, the asteroid movie. It was that before those movies. And that's how the 70s ended. And after that, I think the disaster films just fell out because, the 80s became a decade of greed and indulgence, and no one wanted to see these big, huge, star-studded disaster movies anymore. So, to Irwin Allen, to all the disaster movies of my youth, to the Towering Inferno, which if I see it come on American Movie Classics or the Turner movies or whatever, I will sit down and watch it without a problem. Cheers. From Dad Drinks, every pour tells a story. Make sure you hit the website, daddrinks.com. Check out Facebook, check out Instagram, and make sure you just check out for the reels for the rest of this week. We'll try and do some more drinks. Please hit like and subscribe, and visit daddrinks.com for recipes, merchandise, and more fun stuff.